Welcome. I'm Georgia Port. I'm the proprietor here. I think most of you in this audience know that, but welcome. I'm so glad you're here for this talk, which I think should prove to be quite interesting. I have a formal introduction for these two gentlemen. Orville Schell, to my immediate right, is the Arthur Ross Director of the Center on U.S.-China Relations and Vice President of the Asia Society. He's former professor and dean at the University of California, Berkeley, California Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism. He's worked for the Ford Foundation in Indonesia, covered the war in Indochina as a journalist, and traveled widely in China since the mid-70s. He was born in New York City, graduated magna cum laude from Harvard University in Far Eastern History, studied Chinese language at Stanford University, studied as an exchange student at National Taiwan University, and earned his doctorate at UC Berkeley in Chinese history. He's been awarded a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship and a Smith Richardson Foundation grant, and is a recipient of the Overseas Press Club Award, a Mencken Award, and a Harvard-Stanford Shorenstein Prize in Asian Journalism. He currently serves as a fellow at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University and a senior fellow at the Annenberg School of Communications at USC. He also co-chairs the Task Force on U.S.-China Policy. He's the author of numerous books, I think 10, right, on the subject of China. Is that about right? Roughly 10, 11, 12, 9, something like that. His most recent work is My Old Home, a Novel of Exile, published in 2021, and that's what will be the main focus of the discussion today. He's going to be in conversation with Robin Radin. Robin taught Japanese history at the university level, studied law at Harvard, and practiced law involving business in Asia for over 30 years. He has maintained his interest in China and will soon publish as editor a collection of translated memoirs, Mao's Hijacked Generation. So please welcome Orville Schell and Robin Radin.
Well, thank you very, very much, Georgia, and greetings to the attendants here. I see many familiar faces, and I know that we have read Orville's wonderful novel. So happy to have you here. It's a kind of homecoming for me because Orville and I met about 60 years ago. That is believable, hard to imagine. But in Berkeley, 1963, we were there together, colleagues in the history department, which was distinguished for its faculty on Chinese history. Were greatly influenced by that group of scholars. Lesser lights on the Japan side, but I pursued focus on Japan, but studied as much Chinese history as Japanese history. Remain devoted to that subject. So it is a gift for Orville to come and to provide to us, I think, unique perspective and wisdom on the issues confronting our country, vis-a-vis China, identified as its principal rival. Before I get into addressing that subject with Orville, I just wanted to reference his books, the latest one on My Old Home, which is a title, interestingly, that echoes the title of a short story of Shun, an iconic writer of revolutionary period China, who represents, I think, freedom of thought, unique artist and intellect who stood out from others in his freedom of expression and was lionized and also scorned for that. So, an interesting character. Raised the question how that reference to Du Shun influence your selection of the title. But before I get into that, I want to mention that we have another connection in this room, reunion, because Peter Wong, who is a friend of mine going back to the early 80s, has just moved with his new bride to Sarasota. So we welcome him here. And it turns out that Orville and Peter collaborated on this book back in 1990, which is contains photographs and essays about the Tiananmen incident, often called the Tiananmen Massacre. And Peter was the managing editor, and Orville is a contributor to this book, so they collaborated all those years ago. So it's kind of amazing. Coming together, old friends, one can comrades without any case. I don't know, always a comfortable word. In any event, we are truly fortunate to have Orville take the time and trouble to come and visit Sarasota and provide the kind of broad knowledge, wisdom, and insight on perhaps our most, aside from the next election, our most troubling subject of public concern, the relationship with People's Republic of China. Perhaps there's some unity on both sides of the political spectrum on the subject of China. There's dislike on all sides, but there's also, we realize, enormous dependency and interconnection between our country, our economies, and China. And talk about freeing ourselves of attachment are absurd because of this binding together. But how to understand the relationship and its challenges and how to deal with them requires an understanding of enormous spectrum of information and background. And if anyone has that richness of knowledge and wisdom, it is my old friend Orville Schell. So this is going to be the challenge of this discussion, to confront that dilemma of understanding what we're dealing with and how to approach it, and how to sensitively untangle the intricacies of our complex relationship, and which of course involves a complex history, without which, a knowledge of which we cannot hope to make the right choices. So with that framework, let me ask Orville to comment. Thank you, Orville.
Well, thank you, Robin. It's very nice to be here at this bookstore. I mean, I look at bookstores as a kind of a scarce form of musculature between, you know, the profane world and government and just the rest of us. But it's nice to see a living bookstore here in this community. It's a pleasure to be here. China. I mean, I've spent my whole life trying to sort of understand what's going on there. And I think the reason why it's so difficult is because this country, which is until very recently the most populous country in the world, and a country of immense and growing economic importance, and before that, political and revolutionary importance, is such an unresolved country that has such a variety of potentialities, and it veers from extremes throughout its modern history. And it hasn't kind of found its final, so most comfortable angle of repose, whether it's politically, economically, socially. You have to remember, this is a country that the last dynasty fell at the beginning of the 20th century. It turned on itself. It attacked itself. It attacked its culture, its social structure, its politics, everything. Why? Because it saw them as a source of weakness. It opened it up, made it vulnerable to the more powerful, technologically advanced West. And this is, I think, you don't need to be Sigmund Freud to understand that this is a difficult proposition when you end up attacking yourself, because it involves a kind of self-loathing and a lack of self-respect, actually. And it created all sorts of problems in the 20th century that have cascaded down into the present. And that's what Mao's revolution was about. It was about, as all revolutions are, you want to destroy the past, and you want to create some new and utopian future, which Marx had tried to sketch out, but of course that never happened. And so this question, for me, I can't say I have the answer to the mystery, the enigma of China, but I felt that after writing so many books, I can't even remember how many I wrote in nonfiction, I thought there's got to be another way, some added element that I've been overlooking to understand what's going on there. Who is a man like Mao Zedong or Xi Jinping? What are they doing? Where did they come from? What was their formative experience? How should we understand them? And without that kind of, it's very hard to know how to approach them, how to deal with them, how to respond to them. So I thought, how about fiction? And, you know, I have to say that I think that the reason why people write literature is because it can deal with subjects you can't deal with in nonfiction. And the subjects I wanted to kind of plumb were things like individual, religion, and above all, music, which is an expression of the individual. And what happened, of course, to music and religion and all of those things which which gravitated around the notion of the individual in Mao's revolution was they were totally and utterly extirpated from life. So these are things I wanted to kind of get into, and as a scholar or a writer or a journalist, they're very squishy, mushy topics that scholars don't know how to deal with. They want to quantify. They want some theoretical basis. So I set off in this odyssey. It's like having gender reassignment to go from writing nonfiction to fiction. And it was the most extraordinary experience I've been on. And if you read the book, you'll see that it's an attempt to try to plumb the depths of this country's historical experience through characters who actually lived it, suffered, sometimes triumphed, but sometimes failed. And the whole complicated subject of China and the West, the outside world, this love-hate relationship. And I don't want to underrepresent the love part, because Chinese and Americans have had a deep and profound connection, first through all of the missionary experience. We forget that every single town in this country, back in the 20th century, early 20th century, had some connection to China through missionaries. And yes, it was, you can say it was colonialist, it was many other derogatory words, but these people really cared. And Chinese did profit. Sometimes they were exploited, but it's a deep, deep relationship. So on the other hand, Mao's revolution was all about demonizing the West, demonizing Americans as imperialists and colonialists and oppressors. And so there's this incredibly complicated snarl of attraction and repulsion going on. But that's really what I wanted to try to probe, to come to some sense of how did those things play out in them, like Mao Zedong or Deng Xiaoping or Hu Jintao or Xi Jinping or all of these leaders, because without that understanding, I don't think we can make any sense out of what they're doing. I mean, how can you possibly explain the fact that Xi Jinping is antagonizing one country after another around the world? He's winning some too, but who pisses off Canada or Australia or Sweden or Norway? Who attacks India for no reason? Or, alienates the Philippines? And yet this is what's happening. And you have to ask yourself, why? What's going on here? And it's a matter of incredible importance, because if America, which is the other preeminent power, doesn't get that right, we don't have some understanding of the complexities of what's happening, it's quite dangerous. And I do think, just as one final thought, Robin, war is not unthinkable. And we could talk a little about why I think that. Taiwan, China claiming the entire South China Sea. So all of these things were just swimming around in my head for decades. And I finally thought, okay, this is some of the way I can try to understand this. So I plunged off into nonfiction. Into fiction, I thought nonfiction.
But the novel focuses on really two main characters, both involved with music. A father, a concert performer, musicologist, with a particular devotion to Bach and other religious music composers, particularly Bach. And the son, the flutist, who's profoundly influenced by his father, but intention with his cohorts, and is subjected to punishments, you might say, along the way that involve brutal exile into iconically remote and deprived area in China. So there's this musical theme referred to, which seems to influence the structure of the work, its subject matter, and also its dynamic. With the crescendo at the end, really monumental, titanic. Could you talk about, because that's something that resonates in terms of my old home, coming home to things that matter to you, and through those things that matter to you, reaching an understanding of things outside, helping you reach that understanding. At least that's my speculation. Am I on the right or the wrong track?
Yeah, well, I think you're on the right track. We're all just wanderers, blind wanderers, trying to find our way here down the right track. I think what I wanted to try to do, the more time I spent in China, the more I realized that there are two realms of human endeavor. One of them is out there. Mao Zedong and Chinese political leaders, they saw the world as out there. It had to be reformed. That's what revolution is. You overturn society, you overturn the global order, you change things out there, you move all the furniture around the world. But there's another world that human beings live in, and that's the world in here. And that's the world of music, religion, literature, the world of the spirit. And it was that part that the Chinese Revolution not only missed, it reviled and suppressed. So what in effect I wanted to try to do was to write a book that counterposed those two things. And in fact, if I'd love to do this at some point, write a play. Sort of My Dinner with Andre, but it would be Chairman Mao talking to Johann Sebastian Bach. Why? Because, as I said, Mao is about out there. Let's bust the place up out there and fix it up again. It doesn't matter. Don't have an individual soul. You don't have a God. You don't have anything you love. Your family is not important. What's important is the revolution. But what was Bach all about? I mean, Bach was all about coming to terms with your mortality. If you listen to his cantatas, it's all about the fragility of life and the temporary nature of our existence. And it seems to me that those two things are absolutely essential parts of any life. But if you only live on one side of the ledger, you're missing another giant piece of the meaning of life, that great Monty Python question, the meaning of life. So that's sort of what I thought, let's have a go at that. Let's see if we can put these back together. So I made my characters, first of all, Christian. Second of all, loving music, devotee of Bach. And third of all, able to live in this interior world. That's the world of friendship, the world of love, the world of, well, bookstores. And it is not the world of Bolshevik revolution, Marx, Lenin, Mao. That world is, everything's externalized. It's It's not the world of Freud. Chinese don't do interior world very well. Even Confucius had a kind of a notion of self-cultivation. But it wasn't, he said, you know, the spirits should be respected, but kept at a distance. So he was very secular. Now the Buddhism came in, but that was from India. Taoism was another story. So anyway, all of these things I thought, let's see, let's kind of smoke it out and see what we can come up with and how the characters navigate through these difficult shoals where you're trying to be a human being, but you're in a dehumanizing political world and a dehumanizing revolution. And I don't think anybody can get to that except through literature. I have to tell you also, of late, I've started to read a lot of Greek tragedies and Shakespeare tragedies because I think Xi Jinping, if Shakespeare were alive, could write one hell of a great tragedy about Xi Jinping. He risks doing exactly what, you know, Sophocles and Euripides and Aeschylus wrote about, namely hubris, arrogant, overreaching leaders who externalize everything, and they don't know when to stop, and they bring the whole kingdom down around their ears. But now, of course, in the globalized world, they could bring the whole world down around our ears. But this is sort of nothing new under heaven here. But what person in Washington is saying, let's have a look at Antigone and see what happened there.
They're talking about Thucydides.
But that Thucydides is out there.
Yeah.
That's the world, the exterior world. I mean, Thucydides wrote the history of Sparta and Athens. Okay, he wasn't reflecting on his own interior or weaknesses as a leader or a human being, but actually Greek tragedies got it. But before we even had a framework, I mean, Freud was not even in their eye, but they understood something fundamental about human weakness and character flaw.
Well, of course, the particulars of the historical narrative are very important. Cover them in great detail in your novel and other works. And one important episode that is said to have shaped Xi Jinping profoundly was his experience of being sent down to the countryside as a teenager. And you parallel this in your novel, long chapter on little B being sent down too high. It's incredible.
This was an area that I went to in 1991 when Deng Xiaoping just miraculously appeared and opened up the whole Tibetan plateau, which had been utterly locked down. And I went on a mountain climbing expedition with Qinghai to this Tibetan nomadic region and spent 5 weeks until I had some familiarity with it. It was one of the most hauntingly beautiful but remote sort of areas I've ever been in my life. So that's where I sent my guy.
Wow. And was there a hot spring there that you depicted?
Well, I invented that. He gets put up at, this idea of your book, Peter, Robin and the educated youth who got set off to the countryside. And he got set off to a place in the middle of nowhere where it happened to be a hot spring, and it's called Yak Springs. And he sat there for almost a decade. And it's a story of a whole generation of Chinese who had that experience. They did get something out of it. It was but it was ultimately formative. And you ask about Xi Jinping, the interesting thing to remember about this guy is his father was a revolutionary who got accused in the Cultural Revolution of being a really bad category called a historical counter-revolutionary. That's about as bad as it gets to be a counter-revolutionary. He was pilloried and knocked down. And so here's Xi Jinping, this little fat kid who people report from school was not particularly likable and kind of got bullied, and because his father was a counter-revolutionary. He gets sent off to a dirt poor place in northwest China, in the area where his father had been kind of a very well-known leader. And he, 9 times, he applies to get into the Little Red Pioneers, which is the precursor group for the party, and he gets rebuked. Now, remember, a 15, 16, 17-year-old kid who just wants to be accepted, and he's being spurned. And he's sullied and besmirched by his father as being, that there was a word in Chinese, the hei wu ye, the 8 black categories. And this is the worst of the worst, his father. So he can't love his father. He can't respect his father. He wants to be accepted. So what does he do? He becomes more red than anybody. Finally, he does get into the Little Red Pioneers, but this is after being rebuked 8 times. So I mentioned this almost as a metaphor for the kind of experience that a person like him underwent. And you don't need to be incredibly psychologically gifted to understand the damage that does on a young person. And we forget that these are people. These guys didn't just spring out of the head of Zeus like Athena. They're people who were formed, and they were formed in this tremendously difficult, traumatic, violent, oppressive world of a revolution. And that's who we now have as the leader. And what he has in this toolbox is tools of control he learned in the Cultural Revolution. So he has a kind of the Mao needle deep in his arm. And it's sort of come back in a way that we didn't imagine it ever would. We thought that revolution was gone, passed over, but it lives on. And it sort of trickles down generation to generation in very subtle, powerful, psychological, and then finally political ways.
Well, it seems unnatural and counterintuitive, our sensibilities, to think that China, having overcome its backwardness through reform led by Deng Xiaoping, achieved an enormous rise in standard of living and become significant competing economic power, political power, and now reject that reward.
Reject a very global system that enabled it. Well, remember, if I may dip back into a little Greek mythology here, remember the myth of Croesus, the expression, which is Croesus.
Right.
Croesus was the king of Lydia, a very wealthy kingdom. And Croesus went to the Oracle of Delphi to ask if he should go to war. I think it was against the Persians, I forget. And the Oracle of Delphi said, no, don't do it. But he did it. And everything came a cropper. His kingdom collapsed. So you can look at Xi Jinping potentially as a kind of a Croesus-like figure. There's this development that you just described, Robin, which is quite extraordinary. What Chinese accomplished in terms of Remember, China used to be the sick man of Asia? Humiliating, embarrassing, and now look at it. But all of this now has been put at stake, put at risk by what I view as a leader with deep, deep characterological flaws and an inability to recognize what actually his country's real national interest is. Never mind the interest of the world. And he could destroy it all. And you have to ask, for what? For vanity? For hubris? For arrogance? For what? There was an expression 10 years ago, 15 years ago, peaceful rise. And everybody thought that's really good. No more. Now it's saber rattling, it's ramming ships in the South China Sea, fighter jets almost colliding, all sorts of provocative actions in regard across the Taiwan Straits. And you have to wonder, how does that serve anybody? So these are the things that, how do you answer those questions?
And the question is, how do you manage someone like that and the regime that follows him and dares not to dispute his authority?
Well, that is the question of questions. I mean, this is where the interior world jumps to the public world, where psychology and sort of analysis of characterological flaws or literature becomes foreign policy, where you have to actually decide what to do. How do you deport yourself as a nation, as such as we are, or any nation, in regard to a man like this? Well, you all remember engagement. This was the policy that I grew up in and embraced and spent my life working within, which was, okay, China's reforming, Deng Xiaoping came along, let's help them out. They won't become like us, but let's have academic exchanges and legal reform, help, let's do foundations, ballet troops, symphony orchestras, let's interact in the hope of slowly Chinese Communist revolution that now perpetrated on its people will temper itself a little. And 9 presidential administrations in America supported that. It's ended. It's gone. It's over. Finished. Dead. Gone. Why? Because Xi Jinping has a fundamental sense, and he's written about this explicitly, so you don't need to take it from me, that the United States and the democratic nations of the world are what he calls hostile foreign forces. 敌对势力 in Chinese, so people like to speak Chinese. And
Hostile what?
hostile foreign forces. That means that there is no way to deal with it except through hostility. These things cannot be reconciled by negotiation or by discussion.
And we have people on this side
And now that is
share that.
that's right.
Perspective.
So Xi Jinping's belligerence, his wolf warrior diplomacy, is generated now within our country. Used to be the Republicans were big friends of China. Now they hate it. And even the Democrats are very hostile towards China and wary and risky. I mean, I looked at, when after 1989 massacre, just think of this for a moment. President Bush sent Brent Scowcroft to China secretly. Didn't even tell the American ambassador at Beijing to talk with Deng Xiaoping. And I got the transcript of their meeting. What happened?
After 10 and this.
Right after 10 or more days afterwards. Brent Scowcroft's message was, President Bush is your friend. Don't destroy this relationship. We've got to find a way to keep somehow interacting together. What was Deng Xiaoping's response? Well, he was very hurt about what had happened, humiliated. He said, no. He said to Skokov, you caused this. It was the hostile West undermining our political system with all its democratic values. You caused the demonstrations, you caused the massacre. And he was very, very accusatory. And what that said to me was, you know, even the Republicans then were very devoted to cultivating this relationship of engagement, not breaking it off. Clinton the same way when he came into power. But Xi Jinping's hostile attitude towards the West, towards Taiwan, towards almost every country, I mean, I named a bunch of countries he's alienated, and that's only the beginning of it. He, in effect, put a stake through the heart of engagement, and we don't know what to do now. So I think policy of Biden administration is actually pretty right. It's deter, get allies, partners, and friends together, but don't be provocative. And don't be overly aggressive, and certainly don't close the diplomatic door. Keep it open. And we just saw a meeting in San Francisco.
And you were there?
I was there for part of it, but it was, I mean, you know, Xi Jinping came, he gave his Mona Lisa smile, he said he wanted foreign investment, and all good, don't worry, but he didn't change anything.
I got a question. We all know that there's thousands and thousands of Chinese students that come to United States universities and colleges, and that's been going on since the last 20 years or longer. So what's happening with all these Chinese students with their families and that money supply, because the university is charging full ticket. They're gonna give them like a local discount for being a local person. What's going on with that? What information do they have about that?
Well, it's really interesting that there is this somewhat diminished number coming to this country, but still it's up in the high 200,000, almost 300,000. And do you know how many American students are studying in China? Well, less. That's 397, I think. So, okay. So Chinese still want to come here, but having said that, two things are worth noting. One, some of them are very critical of the government, and some are quite patriotic. But there's a whole other group of people who are quietly in China, heading for the doors. You can't do it too explicitly. And a lot of them are wealthy people because they have means. The question is, if you're going to head for the door, how do you get your money out? There are currency controls. So there are various artifice sort of methods that they can use. But there is definitely a wind blowing where a lot of professional people in China are very, very worried, very agitated by what they see going on. But it's not easy for them just to pack up and get out of town. And but nonetheless, you see lots drifting off to Singapore. Maybe they hop from Hong Kong to some other place. They're trying to, whether it's a stock IPO in Hong Kong, which enables them to get some money abroad. But this is the kind of thing that's worth watching as we try to assess the level of decoupling that's going on between the US and China.
There's a whole generation of youth who are finishing school and unemployed and consigned to the sidelines without any prospect of a meaningful future. How does that affect the dynamic?
Well, it's very hard to know, but when the unemployment rate for people just getting out of university hit 20%, the Chinese government stopped issuing statistics. So we don't know in the last few months what's going on, but we know that it's a serious problem. And then there are many other problems like the collapse of the property market and a whole host of other things. That isn't to say the place is coming apart at the seams. What it says is that there are a tremendous amount of problems. And I think Xi Jinping has not adequately appreciated the degree to which his future and the future of China is actually dependent on the outside world. Instead, he's adopted an old Maoist sort of posture. Remember, one of the things Mao was most ardently in favor of was what he called self-reliance. And Xi Jinping has the same inclination. I don't want to be dependent on the foreigners. So why is he asking BlackRock and Morgan Stanley and all these companies to invest in China? Simple reason. He doesn't want to be dependent on us for microchips, for EV cars, or whatever. But he wants us to be dependent on China in ways that provide leverage to manipulate us. Stop selling us rare earths. Stop selling us polysilicon. Stop selling us, cobalt that they mine in Africa. Lithium.
Handlers.
I mean, there are many things that they would like us to become dependent on them in, but they don't want to become dependent on us. So that's what decoupling is all about. And paradoxically, decoupling was not started by the West. It was started by China, recognizing that the national security threat of dependence was a risk for them. And that's what started this ball rolling. So there's a lot of complicated dynamics going on. And, it's sad to see this country that, I've been studying with you, Robin, since before. First went in 1975 when Mao Zedong was still alive and the Cultural Revolution was going on. And I've watched it go through many, many changes. But what I see, and again, to get back to fiction, I see the way this bloody revolution that Mao launched lives within the system, within the bloodstream of every Chinese person in some way or other. And it has a way of like recessive genes re-expressing itself because the damage cascades generation to generation. My son married a Chinese wife, and she has a group of people her age, she's in her 30s, who are trying to look at the effects of their crazy parents that were damaged by the revolution and their grandparents, and the effects on the third generation. I think this is really interesting because she's got it kind of a really smart, aware that there's a psychological impact on even people who grew up in America mostly, because the parents, like Xi Jinping's father, influenced him. All of our parents influence our children. And how we deploy ourselves, act, our psychological mindsets, the damage that we may have sustained in childhood, however it was, in China's case, the revolution provided a lot of it. It doesn't just vanish because Mao Zedong dies and someone says, okay, let's get a market system going.
Well, Mao Zedong believed that revolution that was needed would not occur without the re-education of the educated urban youth, and devised a program, systematic program, to force them to experience and learn from the peasants by being sent off into exile. And a whole generation from 70 62 to
67,
79.
68, they said,
60.
when he wanted to shut down the Red Guard fighting, he sent them all off to the countryside.
Yeah. So a whole generation experienced that exile, including Xi Jinping himself, who was able to exploit this opportunity in the countryside, at the local apparatchik, and rise up in the hierarchy. But most of that generation who experienced that were displaced. But they are now reaching retirement. Now, I've taken up an interest in this subject thanks to Peter's father, and we collaborated on creating a book of stories of those who were sent down. 42 stories that Peter's father, who was a top official in the foreign languages press of China, and spent a career in propaganda, but then retired and spent the last 20-something years of his life trying to undo some of the harms that he did. And one of his big projects, his last project, was this effort to bring to light the stories of that experience, 42 of them. This book will come out within a few weeks, and we'll present it here at the bookstore, I suppose.
Why not?
And
Right.
you'll hear more about this book called Mao's Hijacked Generation. But it does not seem that generation is restraining Xi Jinping. He has been able to quell the opposition in a fierce and systematic way through his so-called anti-corruption programs. So it does not seem that there are dissenters in the ranks.
Well, I think there are dissenters in the ranks, but you have to understand when the price of dissent is so high, you're left with a terrible choice. You either stay where you are, or shut up, and have to compromise yourself, which creates a kind of a psychological damage of its own kind, or you try to get out. So there's both of those phenomena are familiar with Chinese. And if you can get out and you have money, good. But you're still in exile, and that's part of what I was writing about too. What happens when someone goes into exile? And then you still yearn for your country. You still love your country. You feel most comfortable there. And you may want to go back. And my young hero does go back and ends up getting killed in 1989. So it creates, the writer, My Own Home is the title of a short story by this wonderful, wonderful Chinese essayist from the 20s and 30s, Liu Shen, Gu Shan, it's called. And, he had a term. It's a wonderfully interesting, insightful, biting, satirical, kind of ironic writer, the likes of which nobody's come close to in China since. He had this idea in China of somebody caught in the middle. He called it in Chinese a 中间者. And what he meant by that was someone caught between tradition and modernity, between East, between West, between rationalism and maybe whatever traditional, I don't know, a whole series of things. He felt caught in the middle. There was no place to stand. And that's what Xi Jinping he's put everybody into that place now. They're caught in the middle. They can't run right. They can't run left. There's no place to be and be a human being with integrity and stay at home. And if you go abroad, you run into a whole other series of problems, which everybody understands who's been in exile.
So what do you discern is his end game? Idealized consequence of his leadership?
I don't think, I mean, this is just me talking, so don't take it as definitive. I don't read within Xi Jinping the capacity to change. I think he's a very narrow person, a very insecure person. I went to China. I've been on several trips with him, watched him, one with Biden when they were vice presidents. I went with Trump to China. And Xi Jinping is a man who, you never see him smile or laugh or, how you doing, pal? And Biden is that kind of guy. Hail fellow, well met, backslapping. Xi Jinping will not play that game with him. Instead, he retreats to ceremony, ritual, pomp and circumstance, and grandness. It's very imperial in that way, but that speaks, I think, of a deep insecurity of himself to feel comfortable in the cosmopolitan world. Doesn't speak a foreign language, never been abroad for any length of time. I think he feels very awkward. And I don't see within him the self-reflective capacity to change. And that is very ominous, because it means that you can't find the basic sort of genetic material within as an important world leader that could lead you to say, oh, wake up one morning and say, wait a minute, this isn't working. This isn't good for me. It's not good for my family. It's not good for the Chinese people. It's not good for the world. You've got to try something else. That's not him. He's doubled down or control.
Well, we have someone on our side.
Our guy is
Similar
even,
character.
is
There's no
even
capacity to change too.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I come from a naive perspective. I don't know about but my husband and I have been watching about the First and Second World War, and somewhere in that time period, the Chinese country was actually an economically democratically oriented. It was welcomed into world nations that met, and they were rejected to be able to sit with all these nations. It was arrogance against the Chinese people that they were inferior, not be accepted, and they back to their hands down. That was maybe in the 30s, I believe. But it's on Netflix and it's on TV right now. All colorized, full war film, and all original film. Okay, so my question to you, it takes you forward and which on page. His philosophy, as far as I remember anything, was to lay low, serve your enemy, and when they're at their weakest point, strike. And what I've watched the Chinese over the years is they've been investing throughout the world. And railroads here and supporting South America. And so I'd like to understand a little bit about how the Chinese, of what parliament, I have no idea what the structure is like, and how he controls it, and what basic philosophy is between everybody that's under his thumb, so to speak, where he is, never mind the Betsy culture. Because I feel that the country was embarrassed years ago. Nation 5,000 years old. French, the Dutch, everybody invaded the Pacific and all those early years. And we talk about the missionaries and whatever coming. It was always their superior, we're going to teach you. And these people are highly intelligent. They've got those stages of philosophy. what is the governmental structure and how does that work its way into what we
Well, this narrative you describe of sort of Western colonialization, imperialization, et cetera, and domination and looking down on Chinese, there's truth to that narrative. And that is the fabric out of which Lenin wrote his whole treatise on imperialism, and how the Chinese narrative now of 100 years of humiliation still prevails. And it is not entirely untrue by any means. However, you have to ask yourself this. China had treaty ports, but it never was colonialized the way Indonesia, Indochina, India, Pakistan was. And yet, the narrative of the victimization and imperial overlordship in China has been kept alive by the party in a way which doesn't allow China to move on. So China, which has such immense success, you would think would say, okay, you guys were pretty unpleasant to us back in the 19th century, the Opium Wars, and even in the early 20th century. We overcame. We're successful. Let's celebrate it. Let's enjoy it. Let's change the narrative. You don't see in Vietnamese beating up on the French, or the Dutch, or the Indonesians beating up on the Dutch. It's gone. It's history. It's past. At some point, you've got to let go of your victim culture. But unfortunately, the world is awash in victim culture. Not just countries, but our own society. Everybody wants to be a damn victim. Everybody wants to be oppressed and get reparations and get apologies and get all of these things. You know, that's not going to win the day in the end. So, I mean, but in China's case, the success is so astronomically impressive. You just wish they could lighten up and enjoy it and take some credit and say, we did a good job despite the predations of the West. But no, that's where I think you have to start really trying to understand Xi Jinping's psychology. And his psychology is, I think, still a psychology of weakness and security and kind of almost vindictive blame for the past that they can't let go. But as Freud lets everybody know, you can't come to terms with your past and get beyond it. You'll destroy yourself. So.
Any other questions? Yeah.
It's funny, I have a completely opposite viewpoint, and I was an Asian history major. Although not at but I have the feeling that China is and has always been a nation that believes the rest of the world owes tribute to it.
Well, good point. Because but then it fell from a very high height, had a very high estimation of its centrality. And then it
I
became,
don't think it ever intellectually somehow lost that.
I think you're right. It recognized when it became the sick man of Asia, it had fallen, but it never lost. And this is Xi Jinping's notion of rejuvenation, fuxing in Chinese. And the China dream is all about a restoration of past greatness. And that is also the hallmark of an insecure person, that you have to restore yourself to a grand status where and that people won't willingly recognize you, you force them. And that's what Wolf Warrior diplomacy is. You don't like us? Well, try this on. We'll cancel your exports. We'll cancel your,
I have a quick story. I was in China in 1985, and I was on an educational tour. I got very sick, and I thought I was gonna die. And the tour guide came in to see me. And this is kind of metaphoric of a psychological tone of the country. The tour guide came to see me, And I was really sick. And she said, how are you? I said, I'm very sick. I feel very sick. She said, and I said, but I have to see the Great Wall because we were about to see it the next day. And she said, oh, but you must feel better. You must feel better. And I said, no, but I have to see the wall, the Great Wall. And she said, you know, it's just a wall. And she also was this young woman who was smart as can be, who wanted to be a doctor, but she was 26. And that was the cutoff point for continuing education. And that made me so sad for her. And it also seemed sort of metaphoric of the suppression, not just of women, but of ambition at that point in time. And I don't know if it's changed much.
Well, there was a point, and in the 80s was a kind of an inflection point where everybody was always assigned to jobs throughout the 70s and into the early 80s. And so there was a lot of restrictions on what people could do. You didn't get to choose your application and your profession.
That was the one child.
But it began to change.
Yeah.
But still, the 80s were sort of the heyday of opening and reform and whatnot. But she may have still been trapped in some field where there was an age limit on things. And but China is, in its sort of malice guise, a society of control. That's what it does. You got a problem? Control. Shut down. Lock them up. And give them some thought reform. Make them sorry that they stepped out of line. And we're heading back more and more into that kind of treatment of disaffection. And so people like this young woman that you mentioned probably just wasn't going to demonstrate. What's the point? You'll end up in trouble.
No,
You just either take it or you try to go abroad.
she was caught in a time gap.
Yeah.
Well, we're winding down.
Yeah.
I have a question.
There's a question over there too.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we could take through it.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing all of these insights about the past and present. But I would like to know more about fiction. Because I think that in your process of writing the novel, this work, the decades of devotion to study China, involving in policy making, all these observations, the fight to your scholarly self, the writing self, and the fictional writing self. Because I only glance through the books. Sometimes I feel like the narrator kind of jumps in as a scholar, trying to
He does.
Yeah.
He can't help himself.
I'm wondering if there are specific moments of you making choices.
I had to, what I did was, it took me, as I say, over 30 years to do this. So I put there's a lot of stuff in it where I would skid off into my own little, because I had to understand it better myself. And to do that, I had to write out what it was I was trying to conclude. And then I had to get rid of it. But because in fiction, you have to show, not tell. In nonfiction, you tell. So that was a huge divide. You have to let your characters breathe and live and be characters that your readers will want to read about. You can't make them little autodidacts for yourself. So that was hard. And, I just tell you one thing. My life is rather odd because I spent up until 1985. I was writing, I wrote for the New Yorker for a long time covering China. I was just some white guy who spoke Chinese, stumbling around trying to figure out what the hell's going on. And there's a lot going on, and there were a lot of questions, and I was pumping out the books. But then I met my wife, who was Chinese, grew up in Beijing. And I felt, at that moment, maybe this has something to do with why I turned to fiction a little while after that. I felt that she was like It's like having a pair of night vision goggles put on. I could suddenly see into things in a different way through her eyes. Understand things I couldn't understand as clearly, even though I had friends and, And so it raised an awful lot of questions for me about just human interaction rather than political interaction. And I think that catalyzed my interest in trying to plumb China, to understand China in a different way.
Bill?
Going back to the narrative that you were talking about, Xi Jinping's victim story, psychology, and thinking, and exploitation. It sounds extremely similar to Putin's.
Absolutely. Yes, I mean, your observation is right on, Bill. I mean, I think, obviously Putin's Russian and Xi Jinping is Chinese, but I think what they share in common is an extreme sense of being, the Chinese have an expression, mutual respect. And they also have another expression when we do something they don't like, they say, you wounded the feelings of the Chinese people. And Putin has the same syndrome. What he really deeply wants most of all, as does Xi Jinping, is to be respected by the West. The very people he reviles, demonizes, and calls the Antichrist.
But is there any difference? Is there any distinction? Or,
If I had
some
to,
way in which their angle is really different.
yes, I mean, namely the Chinese and Russians never liked each other much, but that apart, the Chinese call the Russians the Maozi, the old hairy people. There's no respect for them whatsoever. But in this case, it's a marriage of opportunism, and what they share in common is grievous and a common sense of dispossession of empire and dispossession of greatness and grandness. So I don't want to get too voodoo here, but again, it's the psychological sense of being looked down on, dispossessed, and not respected. And of course, you might well say, well, Vladimir, if you want to be respected, act respectably. And you could say the same to Xi Jinping. If you did that, you would earn great umbrage. He would be very unhappy with your response because they want to be respected as autocrats. But that can't happen, and it won't happen. And that's the reason why politics matter. Political systems sit at the heart of this division in ways that they cannot be ignored or you can't just do surgery and pull out the question of political systems and say, let's get along. Nixon and Kissinger tried that. But that was because they really hated the Soviet Union, both sides. So the common enemy was a threat enough for the moment to overlook political systems. And that was Kissinger's great triumph and great brilliance to see that tactical shift. But what he totally avoided was the fact that they had a Maoist system and we had a fragile and sometimes not too functional democratic system, but we were absolutely different in that regard. He didn't broach that. He kicked that can down the road. And now we can't kick it any further.
Well, that's an excellent point to conclude and to give our great thanks to Orville Schell for sharing this insight, wisdom on these profound questions about our future relationship with China. Thank you.
Thanks for this.